is empowerment? What does it mean to have personal power? Empowerment is about having the ability to expand into the reality in actual manifestation of that which we have yearned for. When we are courageous, we find willingness. When we just let go, we find release. When we release bitterness, we see beauty. When we release fear, we find love. When we release all expectations, that's when we find joy. When we release frustration, we find bliss. When we release attachment, we find balance. When we release our pain, we find peace. When we release control, we find trust. And when we release the inclination to force, that's when we find flow. When we release old ideas about identification, we find healing. When we release all the facts, that's when we find our truth. When we release ideas of limits, that's when we find freedom. When we release judgment, we find grace. And when we release need, that's when we find pure desire. When we release necessity, that's when we find fun. When we release mirroring, that's when we find manifestation. When we release copying and comparisons, that's when we find creativity. When we release belief, that's when we find certainty. When we release our ideas about cost, that's when we find value. When we release wanting proof, that's when we can see possibilities. When we release survival, that's when we embrace life. We cease struggling when we float. We stand in our power when we find ourselves a chosen state of being is stable, and it is not subject to passing thoughts or fleeting feelings. Memory is the most powerful activator of a chosen state of being. So if, for example, you would like to feel peace as a stable inner state, the best way to access that is to cast your mind back to when last you remember feeling truly peaceful and being truly at peace. Go back there in imagination to that moment in time and to that place. Access that state and then consciously breathe it in to this present now moment. When you appreciate a past state of being, the very act of appreciation is so wide and expansive that it allows you to open up to receiving that state of being in the now.